Welcome to meeting number 7 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to the motion adopted on January 31st, the committee is meeting on the situation in Ethiopia.
Services are available through the globe icon at the bottom of your screens. And for members participating in person, please keep in mind the Board of Internal Economy's guidelines for mask use and health protocols. Veuillez également noter.
Please note that screenshots or taking pictures of your screen is not authorized.
Please wait until I recognize you by name. Quand vous avez la parole,
Once you do have the floor, please speak slowly and clearly, and when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute.
And a reminder that all comments by members and witnesses should be directed through the chair. And just for housekeeping, I will just remind members and inform our panel as well that I will be using a very analog reminder of a 30-second remainder in your speaking or testimony time. When you see this yellow card, please try to wrap up the discussion so that we can go to the next member or intervener. Maintenant, j'aimerais.
Now, I would like to welcome our witnesses.
This afternoon, Tariq Khan, Acting Assistant Deputy Minister for Sub-Saharan Africa Branch, Hilary Childs Adams, Conseiller Spécial,
Special Advisor for Ethiopia, Sub-Saharan Africa Branch, Stephen Salovich,
Assistance, and Gwyn Kutz, Director General, Peace and Stabilization Operations Program. And I'm advised that Acting ADM Khan will be making the opening remarks of 5 minutes. Sir, I will give you the floor, and we will then go to questions by members. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me all right? And good afternoon, members of the committee. Bonjour, il me fait plaisir.
Hello, it is my pleasure to speak to you today. Since my predecessor appeared before this committee in March 2021, Canada's response to the deteriorating humanitarian crisis and the conflict in Ethiopia has continued to be proactive and constructive. But nevertheless, the crisis is ongoing, and it continues to have major human rights and humanitarian impacts on the civilian population of Ethiopia.
The armed conflict in Ethiopia has intensified dramatically. This has led to a significant increase in humanitarian needs in northern Ethiopia, with more than 9 million people requiring assistance. In the province of Tigray itself, these needs have reached catastrophic levels. Human rights violations and abuses continue to be perpetrated by all parties. Interethnic tensions have deepened, and Eritrean forces remain within Ethiopia. We hear this from independent eyewitnesses and media reporting, as well as from Canadians who have friends and family in the affected states. Global Affairs Canada continues to prioritize the safety, security, and provision of consular services to Canadians. And over the course of the conflict, we have pursued 3 objectives. 1, seeking the cessation of hostilities and supporting efforts towards a political resolution. 2, calling for immediate and unimpeded humanitarian access and the protection of civilians in Tigray and other conflict-affected areas. And 3, calling for the perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses to be held accountable. Canada's sustained political and diplomatic engagement over the past year has helped build momentum for peace. Prime Minister Trudeau has spoken to Prime Minister Abiy 4 times since November 2021, calling on him to engage meaningfully in mediation, facilitate humanitarian access, and ensure accountability for human rights violations. Foreign Minister Joly spoke with her Ethiopian counterpart, Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister McConnell, in November 2021, calling for immediate humanitarian access and reiterating Canada's support for the joint investigative report on human rights violations conducted by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. The Prime Minister and the ministers have spoken with a range of international leaders and foreign ministers to galvanize international action. This intensive political engagement has been matched by our diplomatic engagement on the ground in Ethiopia. Our ambassador to Ethiopia meets regularly with human rights organizations, local governments, and the government of Ethiopia to advance the 3 objectives I've outlined. We continue to use all possible levers to promote and support mediation, a first step towards a durable peace. Canada is funding the mediation efforts of African Union High Representative Obasanjo, and we stand ready to provide additional support.
There are some signs of progress. In recent weeks, both the government and the TPLF appear more open to mediation efforts. The government has released some political prisoners, There has been a reduction in armed hostilities, and the start of a national dialogue is in process. The mediation track is key to securing an end to the conflict. Our diplomatic representatives have also made it clear that the blockade on humanitarian assistance is unconscionable and that it must stop. Our officials highlighted the need for the protection of civilians in Ethiopia with parties to the conflict and at the United Nations.
The government has also worked actively to promote and protect human rights in Ethiopia, including to ensure accountability for human rights violations and abuses, such as sexual and gender-based violence. The department provided over $600,000 to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to support its joint investigation with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission on human rights violations in Tigray. We ensure that none of our development assistance is directed to the government of Ethiopia, nor to any of the other parties to the conflict. We have also successfully advocated with the boards of international finance institutions to ensure that they apply greater scrutiny to all of their projects in Ethiopia and ensure that development assistance does not benefit the parties to the conflict. Looking ahead, Canada will support conflict prevention and resolution, as well as the role of women as peace builders. We will ensure that our future assistance reflects the nexus of humanitarian development and peace and security investment that Ethiopia so badly needs. Canada will continue to work with our African country partners and our like-minded country partners to seek a solution to this multidimensional conflict that threatens the security of Ethiopia and its neighbors. I would now be pleased to address any questions you might have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Khan, thank you very much. We will now go to rounds of questions by members, and round one consists of 4 segments of 6 minutes each. And leading us off this afternoon will be Mr. Chung. The floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to officials from Foreign Affairs for appearing in front of us today. I'd like to start by asking officials whether or not they have engaged the Forum of the Federation. The reason why I ask that question is that the Forum of the Federations is a Canadian organization that the federal government funds. I believe it's been involved in Ethiopia in the past. And in the opening remarks, one of the 3 objectives of the government is to seek the cessation of hostilities and support efforts toward a political resolution. So I'm wondering if non-governmental organizations like Forum of Federations has been engaged to that end.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you like me to answer that question right now?
Yes, Mr. Khan, there's no need to revert back to the chair. Members have the ability to manage their discussion for the time that's allotted to them. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Very good. Thank you. The Forum of Federations is an important partner of Global Affairs Canada, and of course, we recognize the work that they do in supporting federalism in a number of different countries around the world and their assistance. We do currently have, I believe, a development project with the Forum of Federations, and we are in close contact with that organization. Thank you.
And is that NGO, are they actively engaging with the Department of Foreign Affairs to provide ideas and suggestions as to how a political solution can be found to the crisis in Ethiopia?
Thank you. We do. The project that we currently have has, of course, experienced some delays due to the situation on the ground in Ethiopia. It's a project that is valued at $8.5 million. It is due to end in 2023, and we have an ongoing conversation, of course, with them about the ability to support the work that they do in the current environment. But I would just add it once again and just reiterate that it is, of course, difficult for them to do their work in the current context.
Okay, thank you. The Biden administration executed an executive order in September of last year authorizing the Secretary of State to impose sanctions on certain individuals with respect to human rights violations in Ethiopia. Last November, Secretary of State Blinken announced the U.S. was imposing sanctions on 6 individuals associated with the Eritrean government and ruling party. Has the Government of Canada considered imposing sanctions related to the conflict in Ethiopia?
Mr. Khan, if I could just stop you very briefly on a technology issue. The interpreters are requesting if you could raise your microphone just slightly. It'll result in a better quality of interpretation. I've paused the clock, so there's no impact on Mr. Chong's time. If this works now, I think we're good to go. We may have to readjust if necessary. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Is that better? Is the sound better? Very good. Thanks. Thank you for the question. Sanctions, of course, remain a very important tool that can be used in situations like this. We have not applied sanctions. However, it is still one that is always on the table for consideration. We have deployed other diplomatic and political tools to put pressure on the government of Ethiopia. And of course, we have raised all of the issues related to human rights violations and accountability for those violations amongst all the actors and parties to the conflict. In light of the current openness that we are seeing towards potentially some peace and some dialogue by the parties, this is, of course, a tool that would be considered in light of that current context. And we do recognize that the U.S. has imposed those sanctions on the Eritrean individuals mentioned and one entity. But as I said, the sanctions option remains something that we consistently analyze and do consider in terms of time.
I have a very quick question. Has the government of Canada made any representations to the government of Eritrea with respect to their armed forces involvement in the conflict in Tigray?
Yes, we have indeed. We have spoken directly to the government of Ethiopia, to their diplomatic representatives, expressing our serious concern about the presence of Eritrean troops in Ethiopia. This has been stated on a number of occasions.
I have another question. It has been widely reported that the Ethiopian government has acquired drones from a number of countries, including Turkey. Canada has issued export permits for the export of drone technology to Turkey. Is the government aware of any reports that some of the Canadian manufactured drone systems have found their way into the Ethiopian conflict?
We have no ability to confirm at this stage whether any Canadian parts are used in those drones. So we cannot either confirm or deny. It is a difficult thing for us to assess at this stage. Export permits for such optical systems to Turkey were suspended in October 2020 and then canceled in April 2021. And Turkey did not export a significant amount of arms, including drones, to Ethiopia until a military agreement was signed later in August 2021.
Does Canada support a no-fly zone over portions of Ethiopia that some have proposed?
For that question, I'll just turn to my colleague, Ms. Hilary Childs-Adams, who can respond to that one.
This has not been something which has been widely discussed in multilateral fora. It is something that was called for by the Tigrayan forces. We have continued to keep in very close contact and coordination with our like-minded allies on this, and that it has not come to a decision or to a vote anywhere.
Mr. Chung, thanks very much. We will now go to our next intervener. That's MP Asasi, again for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the representatives from GAC for providing us this briefing. My first question is, as I understand over the course of the past 48 hours, the state of emergency has been lifted in Ethiopia. I was wondering if you could provide us with some information as to what that was in response to, what were the initiatives that had been underway, encouraging the Ethiopian government to do so, and how significant a step that could be.
Thank you for the question. The state of emergency was lifted on, it was announced first on Tuesday, November 22nd, and the intention to lift, they declared a state of emergency on Tuesday, November 2nd, and then as you've indicated, it was lifted on February 15th. We do believe this is a significant event in that it could involve, provide greater access for humanitarian actors. We see it as a promising sign of the government of Ethiopia's intention to make progress on this issue. We believe that this will also help enable swifter investigations for those Ethiopian and foreign citizens who are currently under detention, and also potentially enable the release of those promptly, those who are not charged. So it is a very promising sign. I'll ask my colleague, Ms. Hilary Childs-Adams, if she wants to add to that.
Thank you. I would just say we are hopeful that now that the state of emergency has been lifted and has been lifted 3 months early, that the situation will improve in terms of humanitarian access, as my colleague said, and also will allow people to depart Tigray who had wanted to do so and were unable to do so during the state of emergency. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Now, that is good to hear that some promising steps are occurring. However, as I understand, the World Health Organization has indicated that there is still a de facto blockade. What are some of the diplomatic initiatives underway to ensure that there are no more blockades and humanitarian assistance can make it to mostly to northern Ethiopia, I believe?
Thank you for the question. We are aware that there has also been some loosening of the blockade in terms of now permitting UN humanitarian assistance services, UNHAS flights into Tigray. That is also a promising sign. We only provide funding to our humanitarian partners who have significance working in these kind of challenging situations. And we have raised the issue of humanitarian access on multiple occasions. These include the calls between our Prime Minister and Prime Minister Abiy, as I'd mentioned, 4 times since last November. We've raised this concern with the High Representative of the African Union, Obasanjo. We've raised it in calls with President Biden, PM to President Biden in January, as well as to the UN Secretary General in December. I think if there's one thing that has been consistent in all of Canada's political and diplomatic representations on the crisis in Ethiopia has been that call for lifting of the humanitarian blockade and improving humanitarian access. And as we just mentioned, hopefully there will be some lifting of that and improvement of access now with the lifting of the state of emergency.
Thank you very much for that. Now, as I understand, our focus has always been on providing funding so that we can gather evidence as to human rights violations that are going on throughout the country. Now, just recently, a complaint was filed with the African Union Human Rights Commission. In your estimation, how promising a development is that?
I think engagement of the African Union on the issue of human rights violations is critical. It's been made clear to us by many of the African countries in the region, as well as, of course, by the government of Ethiopia, that this is an African issue and they expect to seek African solutions. We, of course, contribute to the African Union, to many of the organs of the African Union, and we hope that there will be consistency in what has been filed with the African Union Commission. I'm not aware of this particular complaint that's been filed, but there is obviously an important coherence as well with the work of the AU High Representative for Peace. So the ability for Africans to file a complaint within their own institutions is a very promising sign as well.
Absolutely, but I'm not too certain as to the capacity of the Human Rights Commission of the African Union. That having been said, as I understand that we have provided financial assistance both to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and to the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, and they are gathering evidence as to wholesale human rights violations. What is the purpose of that? What comes out of that particular process?
So the work of the UN Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission are really critical in terms of the ability for the international community to receive an independent investigative report on the extent of human rights in the country. as we all know, there's been a real difficulty in accessing certain areas of the country. There is strong propaganda war going on in terms of all of the parties to the conflict and the kind of information they release about rights that have been perpetrated. There's all kinds of risks and potential for misinformation or fake news related to human rights violations. So the ability of the UN OHCHR, which we consider one of the most important organizations within the UN system, to go in and investigate independently is really critical. And for it to do so in partnership with an Ethiopian organization, the Human Rights Commission, is also equally important. When we funded that report, I just want to say that the results of it are essentially what inform so much of the diplomatic engagement and political engagement around the situation in Ethiopia. This is our core source of information.
Okay. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Sassi. Maintenant, je passe la parole à Monsieur Bergeron.
I would like to go now to Mr. Bergeron. You have 6 minutes. You have highlighted earlier, Mr. Khan, that the African leaders had mentioned the importance of finding an African solution to the conflict in Ethiopia. There has been, on February 5 and 6, a meeting of African leaders that took place in the Ethiopian capital. Do we have any information, any conclusions, any proposals, any solutions which are African that would see an end to that conflict? Thank you for this question. The summit of the African Union that took place a few days ago has also presented the new president. It's a presidency that changes. Macky Sall from Senegal is the current president. He has mentioned his priorities, which are also the conflict resolution and the peace and security dimension. Even though they have not yet focused directly on the situation in Ethiopia, it is clear that this remains one of the crises on the African continent the organization needs to face, should face. So I think that this is something we need to see, meaning the role that they are playing. But of course, the role of the High Representative Obersambo is now of the utmost importance for this institution and for any mediation effort in Ethiopia.
Thank you for your answer. It brings us some information about the African people wanting an African solution, but also the fact that they haven't really looked at this issue during their last summit. If I can come back to the 3 goals that we are pursuing within this conflict, you said, first of all, seeking the cessation of hostilities and supporting efforts towards a political resolution, calling for an immediate and unimpeded humanitarian access and the protection of civilians in Tigray and other conflict-affected areas, and calling for the perpetrators of human rights violation and abuses to be held accountable. You also say that the Prime Minister has spoken to Prime Minister Abiy 4 times. You've also mentioned that the Minister of Foreign Affairs has herself spoken once with her Ethiopian counterpart. You said at that time they discussed various efforts to help with humanitarian access and also a joint investigative report on human rights violations. How would you evaluate the progress made on each of these 3 goals up until now? Thank you for your question. I would say that progress is slow and insufficient. Progress levels for these 3 goals, well, I can tell you we haven't seen much progress. There has been a little bit quite recently, though. This means that the dialogue and the national mediation between parties in the conflict in Ethiopia is starting to look a bit more promising. There's also the fact that the government has lifted the state of emergency in the country. That is a promising sign for access to humanitarian aid. It's also promising on the front of arbitrary detentions that have taken place over the past few months. So I would be cautiously optimistic. I think there is a certain fatigue, especially with the parties in the conflict. And of course, potentially because of all the diplomatic interventions, it is very clear to the government of Ethiopia that their reputation is at stake. This is a country that has presented itself as a leader, a very progressive country among African countries that is now undergoing this humanitarian crisis and a big economic downfall, really. And they're currently having a conflict that cannot be resolved without national dialogue and mediation. In June of last year, the Minister of International Development, the former minister, announced $7 million, based on what I understood. These funds were to help organizations on the ground and help them deliver humanitarian assistance. Based on the World Food Programme estimations, no convoy has reached the Tigray region in years. So here's my question. These $7 million were supposed to facilitate humanitarian access, but do we think that these funds have been useful or that we've basically lost the money? Thank you very much. This is a very relevant question regarding our humanitarian access and aid. Here's what I will say. In 2021, we committed $43 million to humanitarian aid in the zones that were affected by this crisis in Ethiopia. I will give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Salowitz, who can tell you about specific projects and can tell you about this specific amount you mentioned. A very brief response, please.
And thank you for the question. So indeed, as Mr. Khan has indicated, the government has provided $43 million in humanitarian assistance last year. We provide this money very flexibly to our partners. There's a number of crises going on in Ethiopia, humanitarian crises beyond Tigray. There's a drought, there's intercommunal conflict, there's refugee crises. And so our funds are for the totality of that response. And it's very flexible, provided very flexibly to our partners so that they can respond as the operational context allows. Okay. So when there is a blockage in Tigray, they can shift to other parts of the country and respond to the many needs that exist there.
We'll have to leave it there in the interest of time. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you, Mr. Bergeron.
Floor to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all of the witnesses today for sharing this information with us. I think this is one of the most pressing issues that this committee will be looking at. And we have seen just horrific things in the Tigrayan region. I do want to just very quickly touch back on the question that Monsieur Bergeron had just asked. When you talk about the funding for the Tigrayan region, when we talk about the funding that the Canadian government has provided, and I understand the need for flexibility, but we needed to make sure that some of that aid was getting getting to the Tigrayan region, and it sounds like that is not a stipulation. So do we know for sure that any of those dollars have gotten to the Tigrayan region, that the region that we know has been blockaded, the region that we know does not have access to the medical supplies, to fuel, to food that is required? I just want to make sure that I'm understanding that correctly. If you could clarify that for me, please.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. No, indeed, of course, Tigray is an important part of the equation for us in terms of the humanitarian response. As I indicated, the needs span the whole country, and there's long-running humanitarian crises there. As Mr. Khan has indicated, humanitarian access is the critical concern, and no one's denying that the challenges exist. Indeed, OCHA has indicated that only 10% of the convoys or the supplies that are required since July have gotten through. Our money is available for the response, but it could only support the response when it's possible. So we have we support WFP, which provides food into Tigray. We support OCHA, which has projects going on inside, and I could go through some of those projects if you like. But indeed, our money is directed to Tigray as well. I can confirm that.
Yeah, because what we're hearing is that that aid is not getting to the region, that it is very, very desperate situation. And you know, I also want to revisit too the idea that we also have some humanitarian challenges, some human rights challenges happening in that area. You know, Amnesty International has reported widespread use of sexual gender-based violence as a weapon of war. The former Minister of Women, Children and Youth of Ethiopia resigned from her cabinet position because it was being used as a weapon of war. We have seen drone attacks on internally displaced people in a school that was housing internally displaced people. These attacks on human rights are quite dire. You know, UNICEF has said that thousands of children have been separated from their parents. I'm very concerned about the human rights implications and our failure, I guess, to be as vocal as we need to be against those. I'd like some comment on that, please.
I think I can respond to that question. The human rights situation that you have outlined is indeed the same thing that we see it and hear on the ground in Ethiopia. There are serious violations perpetrated, again, by all parties to the conflict. And I think we have been very vocal in all of our in diplomatic and political engagements, reminding of the importance of respect for human rights and calling for accountability for human rights. We've done this in a number of places at the Human Rights Council. We have done it, of course, in a number of the calls that we've made to the leader and foreign minister level. So all of the normative bodies that deal with human rights, we raise this issue regularly. The question of whether those human rights violations continue, unfortunately, there is not a satisfactory answer to them because the sense is that violations do continue. You mentioned sexual and gender-based violence. It is, of course, of serious concern to us that has been used as a weapon of war by all parties. We are intending to provide
When you say by all parties, my understanding is it is quite clearly being used more on the side of the Ethiopian government. Is that not your understanding?
Our understanding is that all parties have perpetrated serious human rights violations and that these were also revealed in the OHCHR Ethiopian Human Rights Commission report. It did make that allegation of all of them. So I think we do need to have that independent investigative reporting on all of them. But we also, I just wanted to add, we are going to be providing funding for new projects that will help at least the victims of SGBV in some specific contexts in Ethiopia.
Obviously, I think we can all agree that preventing victims from that is the first priority. Mm-hmm. I did speak to retired Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire. I had some real questions for him on the use of child soldiers and how you can see, you know, obviously he has great experience, and how you can see if a genocide is coming, if there is a genocide being perpetrated against a people. And as an expert, as a hero, frankly, and a Canadian hero, I wanted to get his perspective. He spoke about the weaponization of children and how that is a clear indication that genocide may be taking place. Have you seen indications of this? Have you heard reports of this? Can you comment on the weaponization of children as child soldiers?
Thank you for the question. We have heard reports of the use of children and minors as conflict actors, but we still have yet to receive concrete evidence, but we have heard reports of this. I would also just say in terms of the question of genocide, obviously that is something that I think the global community is concerned about. We have not, the human rights reporting that was done by OHCHR and the EHRC did not make any allegations of genocide, nor have we heard those from any of the other bodies that have been investigating human rights violations. So that does not to say that atrocity crimes have not been committed or war crimes have not been committed, but we have not seen evidence of genocide and meeting the threshold of genocide yet.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Madame McPherson.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. Before we move any further to our second round of questions, I would like to say very quickly that time allocations were very precisely negotiated. It is a 5-minute question round or 2.5 minutes. So I would strongly appreciate it if you could stick to your time limits.
We will go to our first intervener in round two. Mr. Genuis, please, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've had great questions so far, and I'm glad one of the members of the government raised the lifting of the emergency order, and we know that it's generally positive from a human rights perspective when we see the lifting of an emergency order. I wanted to refer back to the issue of the American position and how it relates to Canada's position. Would you say that Canada's position on the conflict is the same as or different from the Biden administration's position?
Thank you. That's a very, very interesting question. I think we have a very strong alignment with the U.S. On the situation in Ethiopia. Obviously, due to the size of our economy and our engagement with them, we have different tools at our disposal and different impact that we can have in our engagement on the issue. But I would say there is a generally fairly strong alignment between ourselves and the U.S. We communicate regularly with them in terms of the situation in Ethiopia and how best to align ourselves.
Okay, so different tools, but the same view of the conflict?
I think we generally have a very common view of the conflict, yes.
Okay. Secretary of State Blinken said in November of last year, the conflict in Ethiopia must come to an end. Peace negotiations should begin immediately without precondition in pursuit of a ceasefire. I haven't heard anything like that formulation come from our government, but would you say it is Canada's position that peace negotiations should begin immediately without precondition?
Absolutely. We have, in all of our interventions at the political level, we have been calling for a mediated solution. There is, of course, a national dialogue that the government of Ethiopia had been intending to undertake, and we support that as well.
Yeah, I would just say there is a distinction between saying there should be a mediated solution and saying parties should immediately begin negotiations without precondition. But I think I've heard your answer on that, so I think that's been well clarified. As my colleague referred to, the U.S. has imposed sanctions, Canada has not. We've heard in the context of various situations around the world the importance and value of like-minded allies coordinating sanctions for maximal impact. Of course, we're still a sovereign nation. We should make our own decisions, but we know that there is value in coordination when it can happen. Why did Canada choose not to coordinate with the U.S. in this case?
My answer to this question, and it's of course it's one that is, I would say, an open question, because the possibility of the use of sanctions is always a potential tool for us, is to say that we assess the timing of sanctions, the impact of sanctions, the impact it will have on the civilian population, the impact it could have on civilians, along with other efforts that are being made at the time and that we could be making at the same time. And so the decision was take to impose sanctions along with the U.S. at this time.
I understand that you're saying there's a possibility of sanctions being imposed in the future, but we clearly chose not to coordinate. We clearly chose not to do so at the same time and in collaboration. And what we've done in the past in the case of sanctions is maybe we sanction some officials, they sanction others in order to minimize the negative impact on our country while the maximum impact on the regime. But to say the U.S. sanctioned and Canada did not suggests we made a choice not to coordinate. Can you shed any further light on why we chose not to apply sanctions in coordination with our partners?
I can only say that we are aware when we communicate with our partners and when they share information to us related to sanctions. We do take a careful consideration as to whether our joining those would have an impact. In this case, the U.S. individual sanctions were on Eritrean individuals, of course, and one Eritrean institution, and we did not make the decision to join those sanctions.
Thank you. Just briefly on Eritrea, is Canada engaged in the case of Dawit Isaak, the longest detained journalist in the world who's in Eritrea? And how is Canada engaged on that?
I'll turn to my colleague, Ms. Hilary Childs-Adams, if she has some information on that specific case.
Could you respond to the committee in writing then? If I know that it's maybe a little bit off the main topic, so I don't want to put you on the spot, but it would be great to hear in writing about any work that Canada is doing with respect to that case. I wanted to ask you one more question the time I have, which is that Canada's ambassador to Ethiopia last year met with the Ethiopian Minister of Mining and Petroleum, Tekel Uma Banti. He tweeted a photo of that meeting, and that tweet was subsequently deleted. Why delete a tweet about a meeting with a government minister?
I'm not aware of the deleting of that tweet, but I'll certainly take a look and find out. I have no knowledge of that.
Thank you. I'd appreciate if you could report back in writing to the committee on that issue as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Genius. That's your time right on the mark. We will now go to our next intervener, Dr. Fry, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank the GAC officials for really clear and succinct answers. It's really good to see this. It helps us to kind of dig through all the multiplicity of things going on. I just wanted to ask you a question. You talk about your partners, and then you obviously talk about the African Union. Are there other partners? Who are your other partners? Are there nation states?
Thank you for the question. Obviously, the UK is an important partner. The EU is an important partner in terms of coordination with like-mindeds. We mentioned the president of Kenya is an important partner for us in terms of communication and the role that these elders within the African political community can have in influencing results on the ground. We mentioned, of course, former head of state of Nigeria as the African Union High Representative is an important partner. I would say the Nordics are also important partners for us on the situation in Ethiopia. We are like-minded. So this enables us to, of course, work with these organizations, and then the UN itself, of course, is an important partner vis-a-vis both monitoring and response.
Yes, I understand the UN to be a partner. I just wondered, though, is every one of your partners in agreement that we must find an African solution to this problem?
I think there is generally a consensus that an African solution is one that will probably be more acceptable to most of the parties of the conflict.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question. You know, immediately after the conflict in the region arose, Eritrea became involved. Can you very quickly, because I have a couple of other questions to ask you, what is the historic reason and why would Eritrea suddenly get itself involved in something that has nothing to do with Eritrea?
There's, of course, a long history related to the ethnic origins of the conflict in Ethiopia. Eritrea was, of course, part of Ethiopia until it achieved its independence. There is it used to be the province, obviously, just north of Tigray. There's obviously, from what we can gather, there's communication and coordination between the government of Ethiopia and the government of Eritrea, enabling it to enter the war. When the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front led the government of Ethiopia, that was when the war took place. And then now, of course, Eritrea is an ally, if you will, of the government of Ethiopia. So it's a simple story, but it's a story that has roots that go back to ethnicity and conflict over the last 20 years.
I understand. So can you tell me how this conflict is impacting neighboring countries such as Somalia and Sudan? What is that regional conflict? Is it increasing regional conflict? What is going on? Are they picking sides? I just need to know what's happening in that region. Thank you.
I think this was obviously one of our major concerns, and one of those of our like-mindeds is the extent to which this conflict could spread to the broader Horn of Africa. There are two factors that I would say are regional in nature and of significant concern to us. One is, as you had mentioned, the presence of Eritrean troops in Ethiopia is a destabilizing factor. It is an international issue that we should all be concerned about. And the second one is the outflow of Ethiopian refugees to Sudan. Their ability to accommodate those refugees, receive those refugees. We understand there's about 60,000 of them now in Sudan. So I would say that's the other regional or neighboring country dimension that was of concern to us.
Somalia?
Somalia less so. Somalia is, of course, dealing with its own internal conflict and the destabilization by groups such as Al-Shabaab. But we do not see a direct link between what's going on in Tigray, for example, and Somalia.
So do you see some of these neighboring countries, apart from the African Union interventions and looking for solutions, do you see these other countries working individually to try and find a peaceful resolution, to try and get a negotiated settlement because of the impact it could have on them? Do you know of such movements going on?
You mean of countries such as Somalia, those neighboring countries?
Somalia, well, Sudan, yes. You've talked about other countries getting involved in terms of senior officials getting involved in those countries. But what's going on in that immediate region? Just a quick answer. I only have 30 seconds left.
We do not see signs that those neighboring countries are seeking to play a significant role in resolving the conflict. We have not seen that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Dr. Fry. Slightly under, but much appreciated for sticking to the time frame. Maintenant, je passe la parole à Monsieur Bergeron.
Mr. Bergeron, 2.5 minutes, please. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. I'd like to come back to the issue of assistance that was given to expressly the financial support that was expressly given to humanitarian aid in Tigray. A little bit like Ms. McPherson, I understand that we want to remain flexible in terms of our humanitarian aid, such that we can meet the numerous needs across all of Ethiopia. But the fact of the matter is that according to the World Food Programme, 40% of Tigrayans are suffering with malnutrition after 15 months of conflict. And in 3 northern regions affected by the conflict, there are 9 million individuals that are seeking food humanitarian aid. It's the highest number to date. So let me get to my question. What mechanisms have been put in place to ensure that this $7 million is really used as part of this $40 million package to help the Tigrayan public and Afar and Amara as well? I've been told that, yes, we're lending assistance elsewhere in Ethiopia, and nobody can be against motherhood and apple pie in that respect, if you'll permit me the expression. But the fact of the matter is, has this $7 million really enabled us to get the humanitarian aid through to the Tigrayans in particular? Response. Thank you for the question. If I could just tackle the last question first and add Kenya. It's a neighbouring country that has a lot of influence in the region. And as for the rest of your question, I'd hand the floor to my colleague, Mr. Stephen Salowitz, as far as humanitarian aid is concerned.
Thank you, Mr. The question. Indeed, the situation in Tigray and in northern Ethiopia is severe from a humanitarian context. I agree with the premise that aid needs to get in. I can assure you that through our partners, WFP, for instance, is providing food assistance. We fund WFP. UNICEF is providing water and sanitation assistance. We're funding UNICEF as well. We fund a variety of organizations that are responding to sexual and gender-based violence, providing psychosocial assistance, protection for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. These are all projects that are ongoing. I think my point was to emphasize that it's a multidimensional crisis, but I can assure you that the funding that we provide flows through our partners and into Tigray, facing many of the obstacles that we've already identified.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salowitz. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron. Ms. McPherson.
2.5 minutes.
Thank you. This is such an interesting conversation, and I have so many questions to ask. Unfortunately, 2.5 minutes is just not very long.
And you're using it up.
Sorry, what was that, Ms. Fry?
Sorry, I forgot I had my thing on.
Genocide expert Dr. Mukesh Kapila has described what's happening in Tigray as a genocide. Is the Canadian government, I know that our experts today have said that others have not declared that to be the case, but has the Canadian government, or is the Canadian government undertaking a law and fact-based review regarding the events that are in Tigray to determine if the atrocities, the systematic gender-based violence, the humanitarian blockade, and the arbitrary arrest of Tigrayans constitutes genocide or acts of genocide?
Thank you for the question, and I'm pleased to return to that question of genocide. There is broad consensus among the international community that serious violations of human rights and international humanitarian law are taking place in Tigray and other conflict-affected areas. But as I said, there is not a confirmation of genocide. We continue to rely on the findings of the OHCHR and the EHRC. We understand that the OHCHR will be undertaking more work. And of course, this is something that they will be looking into, both any risks or signs of genocide as well as incidents of SGBV in their analysis. So this is the primary body that we have confidence in and who we turn to for the investigative work.
So we will be depending on them for that investigative work. There will not be any investigations being taken by the Canadian government, any facts-based review within our own government.
Well, the one thing I can say is that our ambassador and our diplomatic staff on the ground in Addis Ababa are very active. They travel, they meet regularly with regional governments, as well as the government of Ethiopia, as well as civil society, and with, of course, with local NGOs. So this gives them a chance to listen and to hear if there are signs of those kinds of human rights violations. Of course, they hear plenty about SGBV. But I would say in terms of an independent, impartial investigation by an organization that can get the access, the best organization placed to get the access and to actually conduct the assessment is the OHCHR.
Thank you. I believe, Mr. Chair, that is my time.
You still have 30 seconds if you want to get in a very quick question and answer.
I would like just a little, thank you. I would just like a little bit of information. I have heard reports that journalists have been attacked, that there have been arrests of journalists and media, and I'd love some information, any clarity you could provide on that as well, please.
And just a quick answer, and we can follow up potentially in a
Thank you.
round.
I'll turn to my colleague, Ms. Hilary Childs-Adams, to respond on detention of journalists.
Thank you. We continue to follow very closely any reports of journalists being arrested. The government controls very tightly the news that is coming out of Ethiopia on the conflict, and so it has to be their messaging is what we hear. However, that's what an embassy is for on the ground, and they continue to monitor the situation closely.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. The floor now goes to Mr. Abul Taif for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thanks to the department for such a detailed views over and feedback over this topic. And as we know, the various ongoing conflicts in Ethiopia seem to be exacerbated by the interference from outside interests. Mr. Khan, you mentioned that we are aligned with the United States on a position as far as our approach to the Ethiopian conflict. But the question is, what is our government or the Canadian government doing to speak to representatives from, let's say, Turkey, from Iran, United Arab Emirates, and China regarding their providing military support to the combatants?
Thank you for the question. China and Russia have made their positions very clear. They call for non-interference in what they see as Ethiopia's internal affairs. So the ability for us to have a conversation with Russian and Chinese counterparts, and similarly with Turkey and the UAE, could be quite limited. But I would say that we clearly discourage the interventions in the region by any of these countries which would exacerbate tensions or escalate hostilities.
So the answer is no, basically, and I can understand that maybe the talks with China and Russia is different than and Iran, of course, but I'm keen on understanding the talks to Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, since we do have some relations right there, because it's obvious that there's so many hands in the Ethiopian conflict that's supporting in the dynamic where the neighbor countries and everybody is kind of involved in this pool. But will be nice if we can see a Canadian diplomatic attention into these areas to stop feeding the combatants and the people that fighting on the ground. To that, I have another question. Ethiopia is an old country, and but democracy is relatively new there. So, what the government of Canada have done to assist a transition from Marxist one-party system to fully functioning democracy? And I think that is that the question is on the right now. There's a lot of talk about this, because if we can assist this country toward settling the conflict, I think part of the deal has to be that to enhance democracy. So what government of Canada is doing in that regard?
Thank you for that question. We've got a number of projects that support governance and inclusive governance in Ethiopia. I think we recognized from very early days in the earlier conflict of Ethiopia and its rise, its progress in recent years, that having more inclusive governance is key to it as a federal state, as a state with multiple ethnicities. This is key to the progress of the country. So we have provided funding and a couple of projects, and we can certainly provide that information to the committee on projects that we've done to support governance. So and we do see that as an important way forward.
Well, that is part of the $43 million assistance. Is that correct?
No, that's different. So the $43 million is international humanitarian assistance. However, our bilateral development assistance has gone to organizations that support governance and inclusive governance in Ethiopia.
How is the government reacting to this initiative? The government of Ethiopia there with Prime Minister Abiy leading to have that assistance in moving the country from long time on a Marxist regime to more of a democratic. So may as a recipe to probably assist in changing the conflict or maybe settling the conflict further.
I would say I think there's a strong commitment on the government of Ethiopia, particularly to make progress and reform in the area of economic governance. At the same time, I think the conflict that has arisen now, which is an inter-ethnic conflict, has raised lots of questions about the actual effectiveness of Ethiopia's federalist state, the federalism in Ethiopia, and there's going to need to be a thorough revisiting of that through the national dialogue process that they're going to start, and of course we stand ready to support those efforts.
Just a quick question, if I have. Do you see that Ethiopia will, the model will look like so much like Somalia, for example?
I think Ethiopia is a long way from becoming a Somalia. It still has relatively strong state institutions, a fairly strong centralized government, but it of course does have ethnic division in the country and polarization. But I think we cannot see it becoming a Somalia in the early stage. It's also still relatively strong economically.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Avoltaif. Thank you, Mr. Khan. We'll now go to Mr. Sarai for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the guests and the departmental officials. I want to ask, on November 8, 2021, Minister Joly, Minister of Foreign Affairs, spoke with President FAAE of the African Union Commission to discuss the rapidly deteriorating situation in Ethiopia. During their conversation, they discussed the importance of working towards a political solution and for the best interests, a political solution and the inclusive national dialogue to bring the conflict to a peaceful resolution. Can you speak to the work being done to develop a political solution for the best interests of the region, and what would this political solution look like?
Thank you for the question. The shape of a political solution is going to be obviously for Ethiopia and the government of Ethiopia and the conflicts to the parties to the conflict to determine. But I would say a political solution obviously has to begin with cessation of hostilities. There has to be a ceasefire. There has to be an end to armed conflict and attacks. It has to address the issue of arbitrary detention. There has to be a release of those who've been arbitrarily or unfairly detained. It has to address human rights accountability, violations for human rights accountability. So if we think, for example, of the extent of human rights violations that have been committed by the sides of to the conflict, there will have to be some agreement on how those human rights violations are going to be addressed moving forward.
Can you speak about the government's work with the African Union? And can you speak to the African Union's Commission of Inquiry into Human Rights Violations in Tigray? On to that note.
Thank you for that question. I'll turn to my colleague, Ms. Hilary Childs-Adams, to comment on that.
The complaint to the African Union has been laid, but it has not yet been heard. So we're following very closely to see what happens when there is a hearing into that complaint. In the meantime, we are focusing very much on the implementation of the joint report between the UN and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, and also on the upcoming investigation which the UN will be leading into the continued human rights violations in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you. At the moment, Ethiopia is host to over 800,000 refugees, mostly from South Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, and Sudan, and they rely heavily on international assistance to survive. How has the humanitarian crisis and conflict in northern Ethiopia impacted the international community's ability to provide assistance to the refugees from those countries?
In response to these other crises, I'll turn to my colleague, Mr. Salowitz, regarding humanitarian response to communities outside of the conflict.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. And indeed, as I've mentioned previously, we do take a whole of Ethiopia approach in terms of responding to humanitarian needs. And we have specific programming that targets the needs of refugees. For instance, we support in the Gambela region, a number of NGOs. Concern is included in there, as well as Help Age, to respond to the needs of refugees. We also support UNHCR, which has the mandate to support the refugee response as well. I would say that the international response continues and is significant, and the focus remains on supporting those 800,000 that are primarily in the east and the southwest of the country. Thank you.
How much time, Chair?
You've got just over a minute, Mr. Sarai.
Okay. Canada provided, I think in 2021, this may have been asked, I apologize if it's been alluded to before, $43 million to address humanitarian needs in Ethiopia, including those arriving from the conflict in the Tigray region. Can you speak to how that $43 million has been allocated and what impact it's had on the ground?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We've covered this somewhat earlier, but maybe it'll give me a chance to talk a bit more specifically about some of the results that we're seeing from the support we've provided. So 43 million indeed has gone to respond to the crises across Ethiopia. In Tigray specifically, and in northern Ethiopia, our funding has gone, for instance, to support the needs of conflict-affected population in Tigray. 877,000 people between mid-October and February 2nd received food assistance through WFP. In Amhara, food assistance has also been provided to 1 million people between January 31st and February 6th. So we see a robust response happening there. Through other programming we have with with OCHA and their country-based pooled fund, we've seen support going for emergency shelter repair, for instance, for life-saving health and gender-based violence programming, nutrition programming to help respond to the needs of children, as well as support through healthcare through our ICRC programming to
Mr. Salowitz, I apologize. I'll have to stop you there in the interest of time. Maybe there's a chance to follow up, but thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Sarai. We'll go straight into our third round of questions. And again, leading us off with a 5-minute round is Mr. Morantz. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Genuis is going to take my round. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, perfect. Mr. Genuis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Morantz. I want to follow up on this issue of accountability for human rights abuses. I'd like to hear a little bit more just concretely about what steps the Canadian government is taking to hold those individuals responsible for human rights abuses accountable for their actions.
Thank you for the question. The first thing I would just say is it is really critical for us to corroborate and have adequate evidence regarding individual actions and violations perpetrated by individuals. For that, we rely on independent investigations such as the OHCHR, EHRC work. We've co-sponsored 2 resolutions on the situation in Tigray at the Human Rights Council, and we later supported the EU's call for a special Human Rights Council session in December. So we've also co-led with the US demarches of Eritrean and Ethiopian authorities on conflict-related sexual violence, both in Ethiopia as well as in the capitals of Sudan and in Eritrea. Our view is that as soon as we have adequate evidence of violations by individuals, we take an assessment and we look at whether the extent to which we can respond to those individual instances, or whether it makes more sense for us to invest in some of the collective responses that are going to take place in those countries. Ethiopia, for example, we are also calling upon it itself to investigate human rights abuses and to take responsibility as a government, as a state party to the conflict for those abuses.
Do you think it's realistic that Ethiopia will itself hold accountable those that were responsible for human rights abuses?
It's an excellent question. I think time will tell. Obviously, we have concerns about whether Ethiopia will live up to that expectation of the international community, something that we're all calling for, but time will tell. The next few months, I think, will be critical in terms of both resolution as well as accountability.
Thank you. Based on the evidence that you have right now, are you willing to legally define any of the crimes that have taken place? I note that that you haven't called it a genocide in response to questioning from my colleague. Would you use terminology like crimes against humanity, for example? Can we say, based on the evidence that we have, in your view, that certain definable international crimes have been committed?
From the reporting that we have read from the OHCHR, EHRC report, it is clear that atrocity crimes may have taken place, and atrocity crimes include war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Sorry to interrupt, but I do note that there's a bit of an equivocation there, because the words you used were, it's clear that atrocity crimes may have been committed. Would you say it is clear that atrocity crimes have been committed, or atrocity crimes may have been committed, in your view, the government's view?
Our view is may have been committed. There are, of course, allegations of those crimes, but of course, we need to see confirmation and adequate investigation beyond.
Okay.
Beyond
sorry, but I just want to be clear about the government's position. It sounds like you're not prepared to say that atrocity crimes have definitely been committed, at least at this stage.
We would look to a competent international court to make that determination.
Okay, but in terms of these various international human rights treaties, Canada has responsibilities as a party. We can't defer to international bodies fully, because we are committed to upholding certain human rights obligations as a signatory to those agreements. And we have powers ourselves through sanctions, but other means, to hold individuals accountable for those actions. So absent some international determination, would Canada be prepared to come to its own conclusions and act on those conclusions with respect to atrocity crimes?
I think for something as serious as atrocity crimes, it is really critical for us to have an independent and competent body investigating and making that determination for us.
Do we not have the capacity to have competent bodies that are able to proceed in the absence of coordinated international action, though? I mean, this just seems to me to be a fundamental legal problem around human rights, which is that we are party to agreements which oblige ourselves to take certain action in response to certain events, and yet we always try to defer and say, well, we're only responsible if somebody else determines that a crime has been committed. Erwin Kotler has told the Subcommittee on Human Rights, very eloquently in past cases that the fact that we are a state party to these agreements mean that we have obligations regardless of what external international bodies do or do not determine, or are not able to determine. Would you agree with that?
I think the key is that the investigative work that takes place that makes that determination requires access. For us to independently make that investigation, we would need access to both victims and evidence. And in that case, it's usually international bodies such as the UN that can get that kind of access.
But then it just becomes too easy.
I'm sorry, we'll have to leave it there.
Shut this out.
It's very likely that you'll have an occasion to follow up in the next round. So we'll just leave it there and then put a bracket around that until you get a chance to speak again. Madame Bendayan, s'il vous plaît, pour 5 minutes.
You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank the witnesses for being here today. It has been very interesting. I have numerous questions. So you've already referred humanitarian aid offered by Canada to Ethiopia since the start of the conflict. Quite significant aid, actually. I'd like to take a moment to talk about what's been announced on June 18th, 2021. So Canada allocated $7 million in additional funds for humanitarian aid. Can you tell us where these funds were used? From your answers, I understand that a part of the funding went to food safety, healthcare, and also to support victims of sexual violence. Can you give us a bit more detail about the uses of those $7 million? Thank you. I will give the floor to my colleague, Mr. Salowitz. He'll be able to answer your question.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. Indeed, those resources were directed to our partners that were active in the conflict zone. Part of those resources went to the Organization for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs that manages a pooled fund, and they use these resources for a series of projects that they delivered in this context. I would point to some of the types of projects that they were able to deliver. They provided a series of projects that responded to nutrition requirements in Amhara and Afar, as well as Tigray. These are critical projects to respond to the food insecurity that we're all well aware of. And speaking of food insecurity, indeed, the WFP has indicated that over the course of the last year and a half during the conflict, we've seen the food insecurity numbers jump from 0.4 million of the population to over 4.6 million people in need. So indeed, the food situation is dire, and the resources that were provided were specifically to help respond to those food needs. As well, I've mentioned WFP in addition as a key partner for the international response, and our support contributed to WFP's response. There have been convoys that have been able to get through. They've been very modest, and I think we all agree that not enough has been done on this front.
I hate to interrupt you, Mr. Salwick. I do have a few more questions. Other than food security, can you list the other things, or perhaps you would prefer to respond in writing with a complete list?
Sure, we can do that. I'd say we provided funding to WFP, to ICRC, to OCHA, which manages a common fund, a country-based pooled funds. That fund funds 116 projects last year alone. So we contribute to these activities. So they're widespread. We'll give you a written response.
Thank you very much.
So I do have a second question. And I hesitate to describe or qualify your testimony, but you seem to have a number of misgivings when you said that the conflict, when we said the conflict was behind us, despite some encouraging signs such as lifting the state of emergency. So there seemed to be a bit of reluctance on your part. I have seen a number of reports, news reports regarding the raids that are ongoing in the Darfur region, among others. A report from only 10 hours ago, if I'm not mistaken, saying that there was a bomb in the Dakar region and that 6 children are now missing. Could you please tell us what you have heard out on the ground in the field from your contacts as well, please?
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And I'll defer to my colleague, Ms. Jar Adams, for a response to that very specific question.
Extremely concerned about ongoing clashes in northern Ethiopia. We're finding that although the Tigrayan forces withdrew pretty much within their own region, that there are ongoing clashes in the Afar region, neighboring Tigray, where there are attempts made to control certain road routes where humanitarian aid has been stopped. So we are extremely concerned that what is coming out of there in the way of news is really what is approved by the government mostly, and so we will continue to engage with the government and with the parties. Our ambassador visited the Afar region recently to get their perspective.
Ms. Adams, I apologize. We'll have to leave it there just in the interest of time. There'll be a chance to follow up potentially. Merci beaucoup, Madame Bendayan. Monsieur Bergeron.
Mr. Bergeron, 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. And thank you, Mr. Salovich, for the answer that you gave Ms. Bendayan. In fact, that's the response that I have been waiting for since 2 questions ago, i.e., what assurances did we get that the foodstuffs actually got to Tigray, given that the World Food Programme was of the opinion that few or only small amounts of food had gotten through since last mid-December. So I'm very, very pleased, very glad to hear that at least a part of Canadian humanitarian assistance has gotten to its intended destination. So here's my follow-up question. In addition to the $7 million, what monitoring mechanisms are in place to ensure that there are good outcomes? And I seem to think that there are. In an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine last year, a professor, Nick Cheeseman, stated that Ethiopia has dozens of sub-ethnic groups, and I quote, Ethiopian leaders have in fact fed ethnic tensions in that region, which has given at least each region at least one opportunity to think that it was being left by the wayside. They added by saying that Twitter and Facebook have facilitated the spreading of hate speech, which has led to atrocities. And the authors of the report are wondering, and I think this is the elephant in the room, as to what the Ethiopian state's capacity or capability is to survive these ethnic conflicts. The last of which we're witnessing right now, most recent of which. Does the Canadian government share the worries of Professors Wildemarian and Cheeseman as far as the fragility of the Ethiopian state is concerned? Thank you very much for this question you've just asked. I'll respond by making 2 or 3 general statements, and then I'll turn to my colleague Ms. Gunklutz regarding our efforts in terms of building peace in Ethiopia. Sorry to cut you off, sir. A very brief response, if you would. Well, didn't I have up to 6 minutes, Mr. Chairperson? No, 2.5 minutes, Mr. Bergeron. Aren't we back up to the next round yet? No? Okay, my mistake. Response. We definitely do share those concerns about the fragility of the Ethiopian state. Undoubtedly, all this inciting to violence, propaganda, and what these armed groups are doing, all of this will make this country even more and more fragile. So, of course, we share the concerns expressed by that author. Thank you very much.
For 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses. I have some questions. People in this committee will know that I'm very interested in Canadian mining and the impacts of Canadian mining companies around the world. We have heard some alarming reports that there have been Canadian mining companies looking for licenses to operate in the Tigrayan region. I'm wondering if you could provide any information on the status of Canadian mining companies that are hoping to operate in Tigray, and whether or not there's been any licenses that have been offered.
Thank you for that question. I don't have any information in front of me regarding any mining licenses that have been granted in Tigray. Our understanding is that that has not taken place. We do not offer any trade commissioner services or assistance to mining companies in terms of activity in northern Ethiopia. So we have no awareness of that at this stage.
If just possible, if it would be possible for you to provide any written submissions afterwards if there is additional information that you can share on that you may not have right close to hand? The next question I'd like to ask is around a comment that you had made earlier in your intervention about women and including women in the peacekeeping process and women at the negotiation tables. It's very important to me. Of course, we know that there is a much higher chance of success when women are present for any sort of ceasefire resolutions. How is that being done? How is Canada working on that? If you could provide some feedback, please.
Thank you for that question. And as you know, women, peace and security is a key part of our government's international policy agenda. To answer the question, I will turn to my colleague, Ms. Gwyn Coots, our DG for Peace and Stabilization. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And thank you for raising the topic, because we truly do believe that the full engagement of women across the peace spectrum in prevention, during conflict management, and post-conflict state building is absolutely essential to a resilient, peaceful society. So my area is very much concerned about building peace at the community level. You've heard of the efforts at the diplomatic level, at the state level, but we believe that peace building activities at the community level is also a fundamental part of a resilient peace in a country which has as many complex differences between ethnic groups as a country like Ethiopia. So we are supporting organizations that are working with community organizations, with women peace builders, to build the bridges across interethnic lines, and also across countries. We have a project which builds an international network in the region of women peace builders, so that experiences can be shared, so that solidarity can be built, and so that women have a voice at the different levels of the peace building process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. McPherson. We will now go to Mr. Chong, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. South Africa and Australia have used truth and reconciliation commissions to reconcile differences after a national conflict or a national difficulty. Former Conservative government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada, and previous governments in Canada have been instrumental in establishing Truth and Reconciliation Commissions abroad, such as the Independent International Commission on the Decommissioning of Paramilitary Weapons as part of the Northern Ireland peace process, which was co-chaired by former Chief of Defence Staff John de Chasselin. And so my question is, has the Canadian government done any work to advance a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Ethiopia?
Thank you for that question. I don't think the parties to the conflict are there yet. It's clear that some kind of a approach towards cessation of hostilities will be important first. The ability for the parties to get around the table for some kind of mediated solution will be critical first. But then I think there is indeed, and always is, there is an importance and a clear value for truth and reconciliation work, preserving historic memory, hearing the experience of victims, and also then ensuring that there's non-repetition of human rights violations and those kinds of crimes. So I take your point. It's a very important point, and hopefully this is something that this conflict will eventually get to.
Well, thank you. I have a question about the region more broadly. The border between Ethiopia and Sudan has long been peacefully contested. Is there any evidence of hostility or the movement of military forces on the part of Sudan toward the border region?
Thank you for the question. I'll turn to my colleague, Ms. Hilary Childs-Adams, to respond to that question on borders.
Yes, there have been reports to that effect, that Sudanese government representatives or military, it's unclear exactly who, moved into that area and has strengthened some of the towns in southern Sudan adjoining it. Agriculturally, it's incredibly fertile. There have been a number of Ethiopian farmers who were displaced from that area, who had farmed it successfully for a very long time. We hope that this will be resolved, this dispute. It's very important for food security for both countries.
Is there any evidence that Egypt is getting involved in the bilateral issues between Ethiopia and the Sudan?
Egypt has not taken much of a stance publicly on what is happening in Ethiopia. Egypt has very strong interests at stake because of the Nile River and because of the GERD Dam, and Ethiopia and Sudan share similar concerns about reaching an agreement with Ethiopia on the management of the water flows. But we have not seen direct interference by Egypt in this conflict.
So in other words, it's safe to say that the stance, the position of Egypt has not changed with respect to the region in light of the conflict that has been unfolding in Ethiopia?
If you're talking about the broader region beyond Ethiopia, Egypt has bilateral relations with all of the states in the Horn of Africa. And they have definite interests there of their own. But in terms of Ethiopia, there hasn't been an actual change in position. They're very much staying out of it, respecting Ethiopian sovereignty by all appearances. And we hope that it will be possible for them to reach a negotiated solution on the Nile River in future.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have no further questions.
Mr. Chong, thank you very much. We will now go to Mr. Oliphant for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm going to be building, I think, on Ms. McPherson's line of questioning as well as Mr. Chong, actually saying they both stole my questions, which is a good sign. And on this first one, if Ms. McPherson wants to join into this round, I'm very happy to give some of my time to her. I want to go back to the issue of women and the role of women and peace building, and our particular penchant to try to figure that out. Now, maybe dig in a little further beside sort of the theoretical about how we're going to do it. And is there some practical ways that we are going to be engaging as Canadians in helping African women? And it may be women in Ethiopia or women in Africa from outside Ethiopia engage in this peace building process.
Thank you for the question. And I'll turn to my colleague, Ms. Coutts, in a second. But I can just say that from a policy point of view, women in peace and security in both peace building and in conflict prevention at the community level, as well as in national processes of peace building and mediation, we see it as critical. As you know, we have a Canadian ambassador for women in peace and security, Ms. Jacqueline O'Neill. So this is something that we certainly see as not just valuable, but essential. We support all the work done internationally on women, peace and security, including UN Resolution 1325. And we believe that a lot can be done in this specific instance, just given the what it takes to bring a community together, to prevent conflict before it arises, and to build the confidence in peace at the local level. Because when that breaks down, that's when the violence really occurs. Let me turn to my colleague, Ms. Coutts, to say some more. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have, since the conflict worsened over the course of this past year, we have scoped out and approved new projects which are specifically designed to help women be prepared and to participate in the national dialogue, which we see as a very important element in reducing interethnic conflict around the country. We have got projects which are helping communities deal with with conflict analysis and with pro-peace activity building. We are working with implementing partners to provide capacity building, alliance building, and to support networking opportunities for Ethiopian women's groups with representation from a wide range of communities and backgrounds. And so we are working to build from the community level the capacity to engage fully in the national dialogue. We, of course, also call for countries who are looking to recover from conflict to fully engage women in their peace agreement processes. Moreover, we stand ready to support the mediating efforts by providing gender experts to ensure that the voices of women and considerations of women and the participation of women is brought to the fore. So we work.
I just want to interrupt you, Ms. McPherson. Do you want to jump in there? Because I know you're following this.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. The only thing I would just add is to urge the government to ensure that gender provisions are in fact part of any actual peace agreement that is agreed upon. And I'm sure the experts have thought of that. Thank you for the time, though.
And then following Mr. Chong's questions about the region and Dr. Fry's as well, Sudan is obviously in political turmoil. And may have refugees to deal with if the border becomes porous. Somalia, Eritrea, none of these are countries that have a lot of political stability at the present time. Any thoughts about what Canada could do to strengthen the regional stability? In half a minute.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. As we know, the conflict has led to devastating impacts on Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. The UNHCR and our other humanitarian agencies are working to meet the needs of those Eritrean refugees in addition to Ethiopians affected by the conflict. We work, of course, to advocate an implementation of a global compact on refugees and the achievement of comprehensive refugee responses for these protracted refugee situations that we see in the region. Of course, that includes Somali refugees as well. I think as we go forward, the first step is, of course, being able to stem the flow of refugees out of countries like Ethiopia, out of a protracted conflict. But indeed, the persistence of protracted refugee situations in the neighboring countries is an issue, particularly for Sudan. So I think this is something that we'll definitely need to take account of, not just in humanitarian assistance, because that's short-term assistance, but we do look at development projects that use what we call durable solutions in the language of refugee response. And durable solutions is the kind of investments that can go into communities that have been long-time refugees, and it helps them integrate both economically as well as socially into the communities where the countries and the places where they now might be choosing to actually stay.
Mr. Khan, I'm sorry, we'll have to leave it there just in the interest of time. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. We will now go into our fourth round, and the floor goes to Mr. Genuis for 5 minutes, please.
I'm taking this round, I believe, if Mr. Janison is not.
Okay, Mr. Abeltaif, please, go ahead.
You're okay, Garnet? Okay, thank you, Chair. There's reports suggest that the government of Ethiopia is going to have a problem to restore basically peace, prosperity, and security if it did not address the issues or the attachment in a way with the OLF, which is the Marxist party, and also the OLA, which is Ethiopian, which is Oromo Liberation Army. And to that, the government will not be trusted by other parties in order to be able to restore peace, security, and prosperity. So, in your opinion, Mr. Khan, do you believe, or how long that will take the Amhara and Afar to trust the Abiy government in order to bring peace, prosperity, and security back to Ethiopia?
Thank you for that excellent question. I think you hit right on it, is that what it will be incumbent upon the Ethiopian government to do is to restore confidence. You cannot have peace and prosperity and economic development with a center in its regions without having their confidence and their trust. A few of the things that the government of Ethiopia is going to need to do to restore that confidence. One is fulfilling the work of that National Dialogue Commission. That Dialogue Commission was particularly about rebuilding federalism in Ethiopia and the rights of those ethnic regional states. It's about the release of political prisoners from those regions. You mentioned Oromo in particular, and of course, it's about lifting the state of emergency, which leaves them in a state of constant terror and fear of arbitrary detention. That last bit has now just been lifted, so there's some promising signs. But that's really the first true confidence building measure is what we've seen now. And now we will need to see more, and those groups that you mentioned will need to see more confidence building measures like the other ones I mentioned.
There was some pressure coming from the US government in that regard and releasing some of the prisoners, although there was also question over some of the nature of the political nature and the history of some of these prisoners. Were Canada part of that same direction to assist in pushing for that process further? Again, to regain the trust needed, because that's the most fundamental issue on the table right now, to ensure that the country is going to start dealing with other problems that are arising from all over the place.
We argued consistently in all of our political démarches and our diplomatic engagement for the release of political prisoners, particularly those held arbitrarily and without charge under the Emergency Act. So I can say absolutely we were part of that overall thrust by the international community calling for that to take place.
What would you call the most significant Canadian request to the government, to Dr. Abiy, in accelerating the process and to make sure that the crisis can be contained, so other fallouts will be somehow controlled and no further damage can happen to to the society, to the people, women, children, and everyone there.
Our requests of the government of Canada to the government of Ethiopia have been clearly in the areas of the three objectives that I mentioned. Obviously, ending the humanitarian blockade, making public signs of movement towards a mediated political solution, and then third, ensuring accountability for human rights violations. I think the most progress has been made. We've seen those steps towards potential political solution. The first step being obviously lifting of a state of emergency and a toning down of the rhetoric. The rhetoric was very bad between these parties to the conflict. Some months ago, it has become much better. And I think now we are seeing potentially the first signs that humanitarian aid may be able to flow better now with the lifting of the state of emergency. But I think these are all areas that still need to have pressure that we cannot let up on.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Mr. Abultayev. Thank you, Mr. Khan. We will now go to Mr. Isasi for 5 minutes, please.
Again, Mr. Khan, thank you very, very much for your testimony. Just a couple of quick questions. The first one, just wanted to follow up on what one of the other members asked about Eritrea. I was wondering if you could explain to us what Eritrea hopes to gain by getting engaged in the Ethiopian civil war. Is it, in your opinion, the fact that they have alliances within Ethiopia, or is it because at some point they would have irredentist claims to Ethiopia?
It's difficult to speculate what their intentions are, but let's just remember that Ethiopia and Eritrea signed a historic peace agreement, which means there's obviously some sense of obligation and relationship and collaboration between the two governments in Addis Ababa and Asmara. It would be difficult for me to speculate beyond what we're hearing. There's obviously some kind of a ethnic alliance, perhaps you might be able to suggest, between the Eritrean people and the Amhara people. I think that's been put out there in that's kind of public knowledge. But I can't speculate more beyond what their intentions would be other than what I've just said.
Thank you. And the last question I had is you were reinforcing for us how important it is that countries in the region actually take the initiative and work something out that is acceptable to all the parties to the civil war. Of the various initiatives underway, or of the various countries that have been engaged in the continent, which ones are most promising and, in your opinion, would merit greater Canadian support?
I mentioned the support that we provide to the AU's High Representative for Ethiopia, former President of Nigeria, Obasanjo. I think that's critical. I think it's critical that we continue to support the work of the African Union in seeking a African solution that is led by an African institution. And the other country to remember, which is very important, is the role of Kenya. So Kenya, its leader is a respected leader, and Kenya does have a stake, as I mentioned, in being a country that is that borders the Horn of Africa countries, that is affected by instability in those countries. So I think those are the two countries that I would single out the AU as an institution, and then Kenya as a country.
Thank you very much. That's it, Mr. Chair. I think I have 20 seconds.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Abeltayev. You still have 2 minutes. If you wish to pass some time to one of your colleagues, if they have a question, they're welcome to come in. If not, that may give some extra time to Mr. Bergeron and Madame McPherson.
Either one of you? Mr. Bergeron?
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Essassi.
Okay. Thank you very much. You've saved Mr. Oliphant's honour, in a sense, because I was just about to say that I took umbrage with the fact that Mr. Oliphant hadn't given me a little bit of his time. So you've redeemed the government, in a sense, by giving me just a couple of extra seconds to speak. And I appreciate that. It's very kind. Now, I'd like to turn back to the study published in Foreign Affairs by the Professors Vuldemarian and Chizeman, and come back to a section in the publication where they said Facebook and Twitter have facilitated the circulation of hate speech, which has, as a result, led to increased atrocities. That strikes me as being extremely worrisome, especially, and perhaps you're aware, that given that this committee looked at and is currently looking at what's going on the border between Ukraine and Russia. And we have gone so far as to say that even in countries such as Canada, we are not free from propaganda. We're in no way sheltered from propaganda which is propagated across social media. So here's what I'd like to say. What is your response to this study, which claims that social media has in fact contributed to the exacerbation of the tensions that are currently at play in Ethiopia? Response. Well, thank you very much for that highly relevant and perspicacious observation. Our Prime Minister did indeed refer to this whole aspect of hate speech in his remarks to President Haby. Everything that has to do with the weaponization of hate speech, of speech itself, is very worrisome, as well as propaganda, misinformation, fake news, all of these strategies and tactics that are used across by a number of countries and organizations. That is occurring in Ethiopia. Facebook, the use of platforms like Twitter, and the fabrication of and the peddling of lies and untruths, information that is not based on fact. And of course, that too is a scourge in Ethiopia and is providing fodder for the ethnic conflicts. Highly worrisome, and we've raised this with the ambassador as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Khan. I'd like to turn back to the $7 million that was in humanitarian aid. And thank you to your colleague Salovich for the responses that were given about getting through this humanitarian assistance out into the field. And given that the staff at the embassy or consulate have left, who is now in charge of following up and monitoring this humanitarian aid? How much is getting through? in what quantities? Who is in charge of that accountability on behalf of the Canadian government, given that the embassy and its staff are no longer there? Response. Well, just let me comment about our staff on the ground in Ethiopia, and then I'll leave it up to my colleague, Mr. Savas, to respond regarding any monitoring and accountability of our humanitarian aid. First and foremost, we didn't withdraw all the staff, just the non-essential staff that left in November and December, when there was some fear that the TPLF forces were getting very in close proximity to the capital city. Now, late December, we reviewed the state of affairs and we concluded that things were once again safe enough such that families and staff members and their families would be able to return. Now, having said that, we have a skeleton staff currently that has remained in the embassy in Addis Ababa, and they are in charge of all the monitoring and follow-up. As far as accountability and with the humanitarian aid is concerned, I'll hand the floor to my colleagues. Sorry to cut you off, sir, but you've run out of time.
Person, and probably Ms. McPherson will give you an extra minute as well, just in the interest of fairness. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My final round of questions that I would like to ask about is, I guess, around the COVID response. So of course we know that what is happening in Africa in general is very low levels of vaccination, very low access to vaccination. I think we've heard from the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center that Ethiopia has less than 1.5%. This is of course massively compounded by a conflict area. I'm just wondering, first of all, what the impacts of COVID have been in Ethiopia, and if Canada is doing anything to make sure that vaccinations are getting to Ethiopia, particularly the Tigrayan region, if there's anything that you can share on that front.
Thank you for that question. First of all, I would say there is a lack of adequate reporting on COVID-related case needs in the conflict-affected areas of Ethiopia. We do not get that information. Our understanding is that recorded rates of COVID are low, but again, in a place where half of the medical infrastructure has been destroyed, it's unlikely that an infected person is going to be able to reach a medical facility and actually get treatment. So the short answer is we don't know the extent to which COVID is impacting the region, but I think we can assume that it may be the least of their worries, given the other health risks and medical risks that are being caused due to lack of humanitarian access. I think in terms of the overall response to COVID in areas requiring humanitarian assistance, I'll turn to my colleague, Mr. Salowitz, in case he has anything else to add on that.
The one thing I'd add is that there is a humanitarian buffer that's been set up through international mechanisms to respond in humanitarian crises. So there is a focus within this, the COVAX facility, to direct resources to humanitarian contexts, but I don't have any further information on the situation in Ethiopia.
So you don't know if there have been vaccinations that have been delivered through COVAX to Ethiopia, how much Canada has contributed to that, and also, do you have any insight on whether or not Canada has contributed anything in terms of PPE, in terms of supply chain, any of those things that will help get vaccinations into the arms of folks in addition to the actual vaccinations?
So I think what we would have to do from our side is get that information back to you in written format. I don't have it at my fingertips.
That would be great if you could provide that. That would be very, very helpful. And just one last question on COVAX and vaccinations. We've heard some worrying reports that Canada may be using vaccinations to calculate ODA or official development assistance. Do you happen to know if that's going to be the case? Will Canada be using vaccinations as part of the calculation to our ODA levels?
I cannot respond to that question directly, but we can certainly get you a response to the committee. Typically, when we support vaccination campaigns and vaccination initiatives as part of overall health programming, it is ODA-able and ODA-able.
Of course, with COVID-19, it is a much different scenario, and we have heard these reports that it is at as high as $7 per dose that would be considered as ODA, which would be really problematic as we try to recover globally from the impacts of COVID-19 on vulnerable populations. Thank you. I look forward to a written response.
Yeah, thank you very much for that final question. Thank you to our witnesses. Colleagues, we're very close to the end of our scheduled time with our panel today. If the committee agrees, what I would propose is to thank them collectively on our behalf for their service and for their testimony. We have three, hopefully small points of housekeeping that I'm hoping to discuss with you very, very shortly so that we can land as close to 5:30 as possible. I know it's a Thursday night. I know there are weather challenges. At least some members may have to travel tonight. Is that in agreement with the committee? If so, then I would thank our witnesses very much on our behalf. Merci beaucoup de votre service, de votre témoignage.
Thank you very much for your service, your testimony.
Questions can be answered in writing as already suggested by members. And the rest of us, we will stay on for a minute or two, or maybe a bit more to discuss a few points of business. Thank you so much to our witnesses. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, merci.
Okay, colleagues, the three items that I have, I'll list them in order of what I perceive to be ease of answering them. The first is a set of three budgets that have been distributed to you last Friday concerning vaccine equity, the vaccine equity study, the Taiwan Strait briefing, and the appearance of two ministers on mandate letters. Is there any opposition to approving the budgets as they've been circulated? Okay, thank you very much, Madam Clerk. We've approved those budgets. Secondly, a point of information, we have an opportunity to have an informal meeting with Kelly Clements, who is the Deputy High Commissioner of the UNHCR. And she is available on March 2nd from 12:30 to 2 p.m. We have set this up as an informal meeting. Participation is not mandatory, but it would be an open meeting for those members who wish to attend. And those of you who will, please let us know. We will circulate the information in terms of how to connect. It'll be a Zoom meeting that would allow anybody to gain access to the conversation should they wish to. That's again, March 2nd, 12:30 to 2 p.m.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, can you just clarify any member of the public, any member of Parliament?
Member of our committee. She has
okay.
requested a meeting with our committee, but we've done it informally just to make sure that members can attend if their schedules allow. And then
Mr. Chair,
yes.
if I could just make a suggestion. On that, I mean, she's extremely influential in human rights areas as well as because it relates to refugees. I'm wondering if we could include the members of the subcommittee on international human rights who are not part of this committee as, formally invite them. I think you might even consider if you wanted to talk to the chair of the Immigration Committee and see if I don't know, she may be meeting with the Immigration Committee informally as well, but if I tend to think that, if we have 4 or 5 of us here, we'll be doing well because people are so busy, that if we considered opening up to those two groups, it may be a good conversation.
Yep, no, it's an excellent point, Mr. Oliphant. I'm not aware whether she has separately reached out to those committees as well, or whether she would prefer to have separate meetings with separate committees. But if not, then that's certainly something that we would encourage to make sure that we maximize and leverage the time that we have with her. Monsieur Bergeron,
Mr. Chairperson, I agree with Mr. Oliphant's comment first. Second, I imagine you'll be sending us. I know that we've already been sent some information, but if you could just send the schedule through to us so that we can confirm with the clerk that we will be in attendance.
And then finally, colleagues, the clerk has received confirmation that Ministers Joly and Sajan are available to appear before the committee on March 3rd. The clerk is currently working on the details with the department, and as a result of these appearances, what I would propose is that the first meeting on vaccine equity be shifted to February 28th. I think there was interest on the part of the committee to start this study before the March recess, and that the briefing on the situation in Xinjiang will then shift to the break weeks, to after the break weeks in March. Just wanted to see if there are views on this. Mr. Genuis.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, did you say Minister Jolie and Sagen both on the 3rd? That's not what the committee had requested. We had requested to hear from each minister for a period of 2 hours separately.
Understood. I'm just receiving information that they are both available on the 3rd. It's of course in the hands of the committee to act on that information.
Okay, so I mean, I'll defer to Marty. It's just to underline that it's important for us that we hear from the ministers separately. So for 2 hours each, yeah.
Madam Clerk, on the logistics of this, anything that you'd wish to add at the moment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The department has confirmed that Minister Jolie would be available for the 1st hour and Minister Sagen for the 2nd hour. I did put out the request as instructed by the committee, and that is what was given back to me.
Okay. Any other discussion on this? Mr. Morantz, please.
It was the agreement that of the committee that we wanted them each for 2 hours. Can we get back to them, or are we stuck with this, or how does this work?
Procedurally, Madam Clerk, it's I believe it's the will of the committee to respond to this information and to make other preferences known. But there's also a coordination task that has to happen. It's usually done through the office of the clerk. Procedurally, what options are at the committee's disposal?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If the committee wishes, I can certainly go back to the department, but procedurally, there is nothing that the committee can do to compel a minister to appear. We are largely at the mercy of their schedule.
Okay, well, I think you should get back to them and just re-express the committee's desire to have each of them separately for 2 hours and see if they can make time available in their busy schedules.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Morantz. Any other comments, views from members?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would say that precedence has been that the two ministers will often be at the same meeting. And if you go to HUMA, where you could have as many as 5 or 6 ministers for 2 hours, I don't think it's unreasonable. So I don't think there's consensus necessarily that we want to push that. I think I would, if the clerk would go back and say that the committee is interested in having them for 2 hours, we can do that, but I am actually quite happy to have them each for 1 hour, which would be normal. Often at estimates, you have a minister for 1 hour and officials for the 2nd hour. I have been doing this for 9 years, and that is normal, actually, procedure to have a minister for 1 hour, followed by officials on any given visit. Having a minister for 2 hours is highly unusual. So I would say that this is within the norms of the way parliamentary committees have worked over the last 9 years I've been involved in them.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Oliphant. I'm not sure if there's other hands from the room. I have Mr. Genuis, who has his hand raised virtually. Any interventions from the floor in the room in addition to Mr. Oliphant? Okay, Mr. Genuis, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just say respectfully that the Parliamentary Secretary naturally has more access to the ministers than other members of the committee do, but the preference was expressed clearly, especially from those of us that don't have the same access that he does, that we would be able to have the ministers for 2 hours each. This has been the past practice of this committee. It certainly has been the practice of this committee for as long as I've been a member of it. And I think this reflects the fact that foreign affairs and international development are critically important, distinct areas, and they require a fulsome examination of each. And also just the breadth of issues that we're dealing with that are on the table. This was the agreement of the committee previously. There was no objection when this issue was previously raised. It was already agreed by the committee. So my suggestion would be that we continue to advance what was the agreed upon at the time unanimous position of the committee. And again, that aligns with past practice. I don't think we need to remake the decision because we already made that decision previously. We just continue to be of that mind and want to see that continue to go forward.
Mr. Chenius, thank you. And just for guidance, the committee then potentially faces a question of whether they would want to reject the availability of 1 hour altogether or ask for a second hour, or, I mean, it's clear what the committee decided in the form of its previous motion. But let's hear from Dr. Fry and then Mr. Bergeron.
Thank you, Chair. I think we've heard from the clerk that we do not have any instruments or tools to compel a minister to come at a particular time or for 2 hours. I like to believe that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. I think we should send back a letter saying we would really prefer, the committee unanimously would prefer 2 hours with ministers, each minister. But if not possible, I think a bird in the hand is going to be something we should go with, which is 1 hour with the minister and 1 hour with the bureaucrats of that minister in two separate meetings.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fry. Monsieur Bergeron, puis Monsieur Isasi.
Mr. Bergeron. Well, yes, in the same vein, Mr. Chairperson, I think that this is a reasonable proposal. We're going to need to remind the Minister what the wishes of the committee are. We'll see how the Minister responds and if they're amenable. I think that ministers are generally quite open in this regard. If it's not enough for us, we'll express our disgruntlement and see how they react to what we have to say. I understand that this is not the usual practice, at least in this parliament. I was once part of a parliament where ministers appeared more frequently and for much longer at committee meetings. So I have trouble wrapping my head around this practice in Ottawa where ministers are inaccessible to parliamentarians, generally speaking. We have to be beholden to their agenda, but I think it's fair enough that we tell the ministers what our wishes are right from the outset, and we see what happens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just several observations. First of all, I wanted to thank the clerk for having conveyed that message to the two ministers. My concern is if there was to be any insistence that either we will not hear from those ministers, or if we do, just given how incredibly busy they are, that it will not be for several months. So my sense would be that we're best off just proceeding with this, and as Mr. Oliphant said, devoting the second hour to their staff, who can be just as useful in providing us the necessary information. The departmental officials. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Isasi. Mr. Abultaif.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think it will be beneficial to see. I mean, the request made by the committee based on the agreement was for the two ministers to appear separately for 2 hours each. If that's correct, I think will be normal to go back and say we've requested, based on the will or the wish of the committee, to have each one of you separately for 2 hours. I hope for you to reconsider. I think that would be fair ask. We're not gonna put them in any tough position. I'm sure they're both generous, and the committee has a lot of questions, and there's a lot of it's an opportunity to have both ministers on both fronts. Will be great, I think, for and very beneficial for what the committee do and for the report that's going to come out after that. So that's I think, Chair, if you can go back and say, based on the first request, I think it would be nice to go back and remind them about what we've requested, and hopefully they will respond positively. Okay. Thank you.
Members, thank you all very much for your views. I think with respect to tonight and the next step, I think if you agree that we could do that, we could just go back to the ministers without a signal of insistence or compulsion, which we cannot do, but to just let ministers know what the committee decided, and then receive the reaction and engage in further discussions through the office of the clerk and myself to make sure that members will have time with the ministers and officials as well. Is that agreeable?
I'm good with that, Mr. Chair.
Any opposition to that? Okay, that seems unanimous as a next step, even though it may not answer the question fully. Thank you for that guidance tonight. Travel safely, and we stand adjourned until our next meeting. Merci beaucoup.
you.